Welcome to the Upshot, Multi-World Disc Golf's podcast about the latest in the disc golf world. I'm the editor, Charlie Eisenhood. Joining me is Josh Mansfield. It is Tuesday, December 13th. World Cup semifinals beginning today. Let's go Argentina. But we have kind of a serious episode today. We got to dig into some stuff. We were supposed to record this yesterday on Monday, but we're actually recording it Tuesday morning because the PDGA announced new guidelines around transgender participation in FPO. And the Pro Tour has also updated their guidelines for next year. And so, Josh, there's really a lot to get to today. I think we should probably start by just trying to kind of summarize what's going on and then dig into the rest. Does that sound like a plan?
I think that's the right plan.
All right. So let's just go over the general news here. Fundamentally, what has happened is that the PDGA and the Pro Tour are going to be restricting transgender women from competition at FPO majors and Elite Series events. The PDGA's new guideline for specifically pro majors, meaning Champions Cup, U.S. Women's, DGC, Pro Worlds, and European Open, says that transgender women are only eligible to compete, quote, if they began medical transition during Tanner Stage 2 or before age 12, whichever is later. Effectively, what this means is that for a transgender woman to be eligible to compete in FPO at the pro majors, they have to have begun medical hormonal transition, taking testosterone suppressants, before age 12, before they go through male puberty. That is the fundamental policy shift at the top level. The Disc Golf Pro Tour subsequently came out with their own announcement that says we are adopting this PDGA Pro Majors policy for all DGPT events, Elite Series, and Silver. What it means is that Natalie Ryan and other trans players like Chloe Alice are going to be barred from competing on the professional tour in FPO. So, of course, they could choose to play in mixed professional open, of course, where they will have a pretty substantial disadvantage due to the fact that they are undergoing hormone therapy to suppress their testosterone. So that is the basic change here. Now, the PDGA also announced new testosterone maximums for transgender women in competition. They went from a 10 nanomoles per liter blood concentration to 2. Okay, so without getting into all of the blood chemistry science stuff, essentially the normal range for women is around 0.5 to 2.4 nanomoles per liter. A lot of other organizations that have updated their transgender policies in the last year have used a threshold of either 5 or 2.5 as the maximum that a transgender woman can have their testosterone concentration for a period of either 12, 18, or 24 months. The PDGA is going further to 2, which falls within the normal range for women, and that will bind for all transgender women who want to compete in any PDGA events. Now, the rules for amateur divisions and for FPO divisions at like A tiers, AM majors, pro masters majors, anything that's not a pro major, there is no rule about transitioning before puberty. There is just a rule about having 24 months below that 2.0 threshold. And then that 2.0 threshold also applies to anybody who wants to play in pro majors, but it requires also that you went through that you did not go through puberty before doing a medical transition. So as a short story, this bars transgender women from competing on the professional tour. Period. There are very few transgender people who have gone through a medical transition prior to puberty. In fact, right now, that's basically being banned in a lot of states. And it's exceedingly rare. It's not that it doesn't happen, but it's exceedingly rare. So Josh, that's kind of the broad strokes here of the policy itself. There's a lot more to get to. Specifically, this comes on the heels of the Swimming International Federation, FINA. They changed their policy over the summer, which was international news, really, because they were one of the first organizations to make a change following the new International Olympic Committee guidelines. And this was a very hot button topic in swimming because of Leah Thomas, the NCAA transgender swimmer who was winning women's events. So FINA was the first organization, to my knowledge, although rugby may have been first, to say that transgender women would have to have, made their transition pre-puberty. And the PDGA policy really just looks a lot like FINA's, including, in some cases, borrowing the actual language from the FINA policy, which puts disc golf and the PDGA's policy into the camp of one of the most restrictive in the sports world across the entire world. So that is where things stand. And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to welcome in Joanna Harper, who is a researcher in the UK who studies transgender athletic performance, and talk to her about this policy. She's an expert in this area. She advised the IOC. She's advised many international sports governing bodies on their transgender policies. She did not talk to the PDGA. She was not brought in by the PDGA. So we'll bring her in right now and hear what she has to say. She joins us next. The Upshot is presented by Pound Disc Golf, makers of the best bags in the sport. Did you know the Pound makes more than disc golf backpacks? That's right. They've got beverage carriers. I've got one. They're awesome. They've got travel bags like the Fly Pack. You can even get a toolbox to have a practice bag in the trunk of your car, a fanny pack, packing cubes, and a whole lot more. Go to PoundDiscGolf.com and trick yourself out with Pound bags for every aspect of your bag needs. Joining us now on the Upshot is Joanna Harper, who is the visiting fellow in transgender athletic performance at Loughborough University in the UK. She's also a PhD researcher at the institution. Joanna, welcome to the program.
Nice to be here, Charlie.
Well, thank you for joining us. We were going to record this podcast yesterday, but we waited because of the news that came out today about the PDGA changing its gender-based division guidelines that effectively bars transgender women from competing in the FPO division at the elite level of the sport. The Disc Golf Pro Tour has followed the guidelines from the PDGA, and so it basically matches what we've seen from the Swimming Federation, FINA. I guess my first question to you is, you're an expert in these kinds of policies. How would you assess where the PDGA has landed here relative to the rest of the sports world as everybody's kind of grappling with the new IOC guidelines?
Well, certainly the IOC has specifically said that sporting federations should be allowed to make their own rules. So certainly within that context, the PDGA is allowed to do what it feels is best for the sport. However, I would think that these restrictions are probably overly restrictive and certainly more restrictive than the LPGA, for instance, and most other sports federations. It is reasonable to put some restrictions on trans women, and it is absolutely true that hormone therapy will not eliminate all of the advantages that those transgender women who pass through male puberty will have. However, transgender women have many disadvantages as well. And, until there's more sports-specific research, I think that, a rule like this, which will probably bar virtually all transgender women from the professional levels of the sport, is too restrictive.
Can you describe a little bit what the differences would be for trans women under, for example, the LPGA policy versus the PDGA policy?
Sure.
And I guess I just don't understand the differences in those restrictions as it applies to individuals.
So I don't happen to have any medical information on Natalie Ryan, but the majority of transgender women who undergo hormone therapy bring their testosterone levels down to female typical values. And most sporting organizations require that trans women do so for a period of either 12 months or 24 months before being eligible to compete, much the way that the PDGA amateur restrictions are. And that certainly has proved to be a policy that has not allowed transgender women to take over other sports. It's certainly true that, that trans women and cisgender or typical women won't perform exactly the same. But it does seem that this policy is a little overly restrictive.
How would you summarize the current scientific research, and I know you've done some of your own, around the advantages retained by transgender women following hormone therapy, after going through puberty, compared to cisgender women, and perhaps compared as well to cisgender men, since that transition is coming from that side?
So the biggest problem is that almost all the research that exists, the published research, is on non-athletic transgender people, trans men or trans women. And certainly in no other area would it be considered acceptable to use research on non-athletes to make athletic policy. It's just that with transgender people, there's so little research specifically on transgender athletes that that the existing research on non-athletic trans people is really almost all there is, and so that's what that's what some people have gravitated to. Specifically, non-athletic transgender women on hormone therapy have fairly minimal strength losses. And that was certainly alluded to in the policy. But non-athletic trans women will also have strength well below typical male non-athletes prior to starting hormone therapy, largely because non-athletic trans women are very non-athletic and not interested in sports. And so if you're looking at retained strength advantages. Two papers suggest that trans women will maintain about a third of the strength advantage. Non-athletic trans women maintain about a third of the strength advantage that non-athletic cisgender men have over cisgender women. Again, these are all non-athletes, and what does it say about athletes is debatable. Here at Loughborough University, we have 3 studies undergoing on trans athletes. The studies are ongoing, and I'm not allowed to share our data with you. But once those data are published, and there are some other studies on trans athletes that are in the works, I think we will have better data. There is one study of transgender Air Force personnel, and the Air Force personnel have 3 fitness tests: a 1.5 mile run, how many sit-ups and push-ups you can do in a minute. And for instance, if we're looking at strength, the trans women in that study started the study with a 31% advantage over the cisgender women in the number of push-ups they could do per minute. That advantage was entirely eliminated with 2 years of hormone therapy. Now that's one study. They didn't look at training, which is an important component. And they're studying something fairly specific, the number of push-ups per minute that you can do. But that is a strength-related activity, and the entire advantage went away with hormone therapy. Again, what that says about disc golf, it's so early in the process that it's really hard to say anything definitive. But it's certainly true that if you look across all sports, trans women are hugely underrepresented. And it often becomes problematic, however, when trans women win something, especially something such as a professional tournament. And so, it's certainly very possible that this rule is a result of the 2 wins this year.
When you look at the different policies that sporting organizations have implemented, from what it seems ultimate Frisbee, which I know has perhaps the least restrictive, as no guidelines, and allows individuals to compete in whichever division they feel most comfortable in, as opposed to disc golf, for example, that we now are kind of seeing as one of the more restrictive policies. Where do you find the policy that strikes the best balance, or in your opinion is the most conducive to research that currently exists and creates, in your opinion, the best sporting event?
Well, what I tell sporting organizations when they talk to me is that any policy they create now should be considered a living document and modified as future research indicates. So I wouldn't say there's anything definitive, but that certainly if you look at the new amateur policy that PDGA has put into effect, I would say that's probably an acceptable policy for the professional as well. That, if you were to ask me that question. Now, I think it very much depends on how much money is in the sport, whether there's drug testing. Oh, do they drug test in PDGA?
Hypothetically, but I actually don't know of any actual drug testing taking place. I think it's like in the rules, but they don't do it.
Right. So if that's the case, then trans athletes would be the only ones subject to tests, right? And so, if you're not drug testing anyone else, can you justify requiring, and if I read the policy correctly, there's probably not any random out of competition testing, and it looks like they're going to rely on tests from the trans athletes' physicians. But they don't require that from anyone else. And so, that doesn't seem very consistent to me.
From what you know of other sports policies right now, I mean, I'm looking at FINA and World Rugby and other sports that have adopted similarly restrictive, frames for how to allow participation for transgender women. This does seem like one of the most restrictive that I can find. Is that how you would describe it as well?
Yeah, it's reasonable to describe it that way. Sure. World athletics or track and field, where female athletes can earn hundreds of thousands of dollars of prize money a year, has a far less restrictive policy. And, not only have trans women not taken over, trans women haven't won anything in world athletics. And so I do think that this policy is probably overly reactive to one athlete, perhaps.
If you were advising the PDGA at this point, they've come out with the policy. So like it's, the board has made their vote and this is what we have. What would you tell them as they move forward? I mean, they did have some language in there that they're going to be considering this, not a finished decision, that they're going to continue to monitor the research, et cetera. So what would you tell them to do as an organization at this point?
Well, look for research out of Loughborough University in the next year or two. They didn't ask me. It looks like they brought in 7 people, and I certainly wasn't one. So, at this point, they've made their decision. And they're not going to change that decision just because I come on your podcast. We just have to see how this plays out. I don't know if the trans players are considering their legal options at this point. I don't know how.
I can tell you that they are. I've spoken to Natalie Ryan, and she told me that she is planning to form a legal challenge.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. And it will be very interesting to see where this goes. FINA, for instance, which put in, a fairly similar policy. There are no trans women swimming at international levels, competing in international level swimming. So there's nobody who can challenge that policy because there's no trans women covered by it. So it will certainly be interesting if Natalie does mount a challenge to see where that challenge goes.
Well, Joanna, thank you. This has been fascinating. And when should we expect the research to come out of Loughborough University?
Sometime in 2023.
All right. Well, we appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Joanna Harper with us here on The Upshot. We will be right back. Welcome back to The Upshot. Really just fantastic for Joanna to take time out of her day and her schedule to come join us on about 30 minutes notice. So really appreciate that. Josh, what are your thoughts on what she had to say about the PDGA policy?
There are a couple of things that stand out to me from this interview. The first of which is, as each sport has looked at why they choose to implement the policy that they did, right? I kind of asked her about what do you see as being the ideal model in her opinion, the one that does balance kind of both the inclusion as well as the fairness, given that the PDGA has taken perhaps one of the most strict looks in a non-safety related view, right? Rugby, we know, has, I believe, outright banned transgender women from playing in women protected divisions, and they do so under, the banner of safety. And so when I ask that question about compromise, what stands out to me is that her answer is one, even in that short 30 seconds, that says, well, I mean, that really depends on the sport. And when you look at the sport, and I don't see in the PDGA decision, either the announcement or in the guidelines itself, an explanation around the 2 units of testosterone. I don't understand if the PDGA is going to take one of the most, like, the strictest policies in sports. What is the justification about why disc golf needs that level of protection relative to other sports? And that's not even mentioning the part that's just a look at the actual testosterone limits, not the pre-puberty transition as well. Because if that's such an effective bar, I guess the biggest thing about the policy that I'm confused about is why 2 units of testosterone? And that's, I was hoping to get an answer from Joanna, and didn't get. And I don't think that's Joanna's fault. I think that's just still a lack of confusion, or a confusion around me, and a lack of understanding about why that was the decision of the PDGA. Do you feel in the same vein in that area?
Well, that number, I mean, I've the research I've done so far, I'm not an expert in this topic.
Sure.
I would consider myself like more educated than the average person, but I've looked to see if other sports federations have used this 2.0 measure, and they basically haven't. I do think that in general, when trans women are taking testosterone suppressants, they are typically going to end up below that number. So it's not like it's untenable or something, or that it's like an impossibility that it would bar transgender women from all competition, as a sort of like as a way of creating a ban without saying you're banning. But it still doesn't really make much sense, like, to have it fall within the normal range. And I mean, there have already been people raising the question about how is this all going to be enforced, particularly at the levels where, you are allowed to play at pretty much every single level except the elite series and the majors. Transgender women can play as long as they have, now I guess, documentation of 24 months of being below this 2 nanomal level. So the thing about it is, like, that's a great question, because how are people going to determine, who's going to say, like, oh, that person is trans, like, they need to have their blood tested? Like, that's going to happen, right? Like, people are going to start doing that kind of thing. And the PDGA has no apparatus in place for actually enforcing any of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think it needs to be acknowledged that the impetus for this change does very clearly seem to be around Natalie Ryan and her success on the pro tour and at the professional level. I mean, let's just be honest. FINA, the Swimming Federation, I think similarly was reacting to the Leah Thomas situation, which wasn't really under their purview specifically because that was NCAA, but it was a very big topic in the swimming world. This has been a big topic in the disc golf world. And, we're going to talk more about the medical committee findings and the survey results, which have all been made public, which I think is, I'm thankful to the PDGA and the board for doing that. But this feels very much as a reaction to Natalie Ryan. And I mean, I think that the Disc Golf Pro Tour, immediately coming out and matching these guidelines, within an hour of the PDGA announcement, clearly there's been coordination on this topic between the PDGA and the Pro Tour. And clearly the decision was, we don't want Natalie Ryan to be playing in our tournaments anymore. And, you know, we could talk about why, and we could talk about like, because remember, Natalie Ryan has really followed all of the guidelines to a T and has like submitted the documentation and followed all the rules around testosterone level and whatnot. You know, the science that does exist, and I think Joanna described this well, you know, we don't have great representative samples among athletes, but what we do have about general population people is that, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, trans women have an advantage over cis women in strength, but have a disadvantage relative to men once they've gone through hormone therapy. So they kind of fall in this middle range. And how do you deal with that effectively? Mm-hmm. You know, the IOC framework for sports governing bodies to make these new rules themselves, the first principle is inclusion. And I don't think that you can really describe this policy as being particularly inclusive at the elite level. I think it's a fair policy at the amateur level, let's call it, at lower levels of the sport, but you know, it's not accurate to call this inclusive at the top end because it's effectively a ban. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, you know, is that the right policy given the current knowledge on this topic, and the fact that this is all going to roll out January 1st with no notice? We can dig into it more, and we will, but those are some things to be thinking about.
With those, I want to touch back on the enforcement mechanism and a couple of things there, because the PDGA medical policy does on Section E provide eligibility verification. Number one, it says the PDGA provides tools for relevant staff to determine the eligibility of each competitor for each event and division in which they are registered. I laugh because I'm like, what tools do they provide? Like, what does that mean? Like, I think of another rule that is wholly unenforceable, and that is disc weight. You know, your disc has to be above 150 grams and below, typically 175, mids or 180-ish, because of the larger diameter, unless it's a super class disc. Anyway, but like, let's say I have a, you know, really flippy disc and my competitor's like, yo, TD, I want this checked. Like, I think it's 130 grams. I can understand the T. I think it'd be ridiculous, but he or she could pull out a scale and set the disc on a scale, and we'd understand it. How do you plan on enforcing this at the amateur level? Like, if someone doesn't self-report, what tools are going to be used for, like, are they going to be like, we're going to draw your blood now? Like, that first part to me is just laughable. The second question I have, though, is for the Disc Golf Pro Tour, because the third part on that section is eligibility verification procedures that require documentation from all participants will be implemented for all PDGA majors. So my understanding then is to play in of that rule is to play in a protected division in a major. All members of that division will have to submit documentation.
Read the rule again.
Eligibility verification procedures that require documentation from all participants will be implemented for all PDGA majors.
I mean, if you're reading that by the book, I mean, to me, that's a question for the PDGA. Like, so that makes no sense. What are they gonna require that, you know, you show a birth certificate that you were assigned female at birth? I mean, I guess that's possible.
And just, you know, so yeah, if we're saying now all FPO players that play in a PDGA major have to show a birth certificate, my question then is for the Disc Golf Pro Tour, who said that they're adopting the same standard. Are they going to do the same verification check?
Well, and let's keep in mind, we also have this testosterone level that falls within the normal range of women. So let's say you're a woman who has on the high end of normal, that you have 2.2 nanomoles per liter testosterone, and you're a female, you were born a female, you're cisgender. Is there a question about I mean, in the guidelines, it doesn't say that there's going to be questions there. But I feel like this opens the door to questions about, well, that's your testosterone is too high. And like there are extreme examples of this in sports, like Caster Semenya, who had really abnormally high testosterone levels and was essentially barred from competing because of it. Now that, is admittedly a very sort of one end of the spectrum example, but we're talking about a limit set for trans women that could be below what a cisgender woman has.
Yeah.
And so like that's why the number doesn't make very much sense to me.
The enforcement mechanism and choice of the number is just so, especially given that this is coming out in 2.5 weeks.
Yeah.
I just don't know what that's going to look like, or how they thought, oh yes, this in 2 weeks, RTDs are going to be ready to handle this matter.
I mean, again, what is this policy, Josh? This policy is about Natalie Ryan. It really is. And like, obviously there was going to be an update coming anyway, but I think that the way this has played out is a lot about Natalie Ryan. So let's talk about a couple other topics here.
Okay.
The PDGA pulled together a medical subcommittee to essentially do fact finding and present a report to the board for consideration. That medical subcommittee report is public. You can go find it. It's on the PDGA website, and it's linked in the article I wrote about this. I mean, it's a total joke. It's embarrassing. I think if you were involved in this medical subcommittee and you signed off on this report as like, this is our scientific best understanding of this topic, you should be embarrassed. You really should. It doesn't handle the topic with the gravity that it should. It's written very poorly. It has citations to opinion articles in the actual text, quotations from opinion article in Newsweek. Yeah. It has links to like a homework help website. Like it's a real mess. It's a real mess. And like, it doesn't grapple with some of the like difficulties of the research. It spends the majority of its time describing the sex differences between men and women, which, while you need to establish that, is not really the topic of discussion here. It's more about what is the situation with transgender women relative to people who are born women, and what is the science telling us about the relationship between those things, and like, how does hormone therapy impact it? It spends very little time actually digging into those topics. And so it's totally embarrassing that this is the like foundation medical document that the PDGA put together. Who wrote this? I just, even if you feel that the policy is correct and that, it is the right thing to do for disc golf to have a restrictive policy around transgender women competing in FPO, even if you completely agree with all of that, I seriously, you should go and look at this medical subcommittee report, because the fact that this is the foundation of where these policies come from is shocking.
So I want to just read a small part of this. There's a section in here, page 5, that says the anthropometric sex differences of the backhand drive, right? This is kind of the foundational point of the argument that the backhand, like that disc golf in particular, transgender women retain advantages over men, even if you don't like the considerations of strength. So they first reference a couple articles that talk about the qualitative biometrics of disc golf. Great. That's fine. It goes down. It talks and kind of describes the backhand drive. Preparations involve rotation of the shoulder girdle away from the direction of the throw, reaching to the rear with the disc. As the spine rotates, the pull begins, etc. It then gets to this conclusion. The bicromial width of the average man is 16.3 inches as compared to 14.4 inches for women. Citation, Anthropometrics, no date. You go down to that citation and this is what you referenced, Charlie, CourseHero.com is where they pulled this information. It then continues, there is a dual effect of greater strength and better mechanical advantage favoring males. In addition, the male generates more rotational force due to the greater movement, distance over which the disc moves, in the pull phase. The arm movement is greater for men than women as a result of differential arm lengths, again, from anthropometric node. Well, there's no citation, so I can only assume it comes from anthropometric node 8. 30.9 inches average for men and 28.4 inches for women. And then they say, yep, therefore men can throw backhands further. That's it. End point, move on. So the only argument that they make in the foundational point of why disc golf it has that inherent disadvantage comes from CourseHero.com. And that's their analysis.
Yeah, it's not great.
It's not. Yeah,
and again,
it's bad.
I think intuitively we can understand. Like, we don't necessarily need science to specifically tell us that in general men can throw a frisbee further than women. Right? We all have our eyes and we can see that is true on average. But just the quality of this document is very poor. And it's not good for that to be the thing that, you're like, okay, well, like, what is the substance of the medical discussion here? And it's very weak. Like, that's not a good thing, right? When one of the core points in the whole thing, like one of the key pieces for describing that transgender women retain advantages over cisgender women is a quotation of an opinion article in Newsweek.
Yeah.
That is one of the core quotes. It's not good. It is not good.
The other thing I would add is that you have researchers like Joanna and other articles that I would say are much better done and provide better research. And there's no consideration of those articles either in this piece. And I think that's the part that's most frustrating to me is I read this and I don't get a sense of the holistic nature of the literature on this subject, which I mean, that was writing point. 101.
That is the reason we asked you to make a subcommittee in the first place.
Right. And they say, like, we are just here to inform policy. We don't have opinions on the matter. But, like, there is no holistic discussion of the research that exists in any means.
Or the limitations of the research. I mean, we got more credible analysis from Joanna in a 10-minute interview than we did from this entire document.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like the conclusion begins. Let me find the quote. It is important to establish policies that are both It is important to establish policies that are both inclusive and fair. In terms of fairness, no transgender person should ever be excluded. Also, with respect to fairness, the science is clear. Males have a natural advantage over women. Okay. Thus, while it would be unfair for transgender women to compete against cisgender women, there would be no question of unfairness if transgender men or transgender women were to compete in the mixed divisions. Okay, so this is the conclusion to this summary, okay? They say it's important to establish policies that are inclusive and fair. Okay, great. No transgender person should be excluded. Yes. With respect to fairness, the science is clear. Males have a natural advantage over women. Agreed. There's dozens, hundreds of years of literature that describe that males have an advantage over women when it comes to athletics. Thus, while it would be unfair for transgender women to compete against cisgender women, like, where are we here? You did not establish anything in here that's like transgender women are not directly comparable to males. I'm sorry. The science is very clear about that. If you undergo years of testosterone suppression, You are going to lose strength. You are going to lose VO2 max. There's going to be a ton of changes to your body. The question is, how much do those changes affect you relative to your baseline? And does it make it fair for you at that point to compete with women? That is definitely a question that is the whole purpose of this topic. But that conclusion to this medical subcommittee summary is insane. It's insane. It's terrible. It's embarrassing. This should have been completely thrown out and redone.
Can I add two more things real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think this summary is just a great punching bag. Number one, if I had written the sentence, the science is clear, or there would be no question of unfairness, my professor would have given me that paper back and would not have read the rest of it. Like, he'd be like, absolutely not. You don't make, especially in a field that Joanna comes out and says, the first thing Joanna says is, we don't have the relevant research that we need in athletics.
But Josh, this says the science is clear that males have an advantage over women, that's a true statement.
Right, because it's not.
But they then go from that to saying clearly then it's unfair for transgender women to compete with cisgender women. It's like, wait, what do you mean? You haven't bridged this gap in any meaningful way. You quoted a Newsweek article. Like, what's frustrating is that there is a world in which there is a very good medical subcommittee report, which may conclude still
the same thing. Yes,
they feel that there is limited evidence that transgender women retain advantages over cisgender women. Like, that is a real report that could exist. But this is trash.
The other thing that's funny is, that sentence, the second sentence of the conclusion, in terms of fairness, no transgender person should ever be excluded. Don't they mean in terms of inclusivity? Like, that's just a typo. That's not even.
It's so bad.
And
we're not even really. This is not cherry picking. This is not unfair.
No.
Look at it for yourself. Okay. I also want to talk, Josh, about the survey, because that's also a big piece of this.
Well, especially given that the medical subcommittee report's not worth reading. So, right. That's the other half.
So there was a survey done. We remember we've talked about this when it came out. Justin Menichelli, the former PDGA board president, put this survey out, kind of like in collaboration with his university, where he's a professor. And what's amazing about this is they got 35,901 PDGA members completing the survey. I mean, this is, to put it in context, that's a 30, was they give the number?
32%
response rate. That is just colossal. It is a colossal number of people responding and filling this out. And voting in PDGA elections is a much smaller fraction of PDGA members than this. To describe this broadly, the majority of members, including the majority of basically every subdivision of the data that you want to look at, whether it's women, amateurs, professionals, women who compete on the Disc Golf Pro Tour, however you want to slice the data, a majority of respondents said that they strongly disagreed, or that they disagreed with the idea that transgender women should be allowed to compete with other women in disc golf, whether without hormone therapy, with hormone therapy, you name it. 67% of all members disagreed or strongly disagreed with the statement, transgender women should be allowed to compete with other women in disc golf and in other sports. And I think notably 80% of those who reported themselves as women primarily competing in DGPT events, 80% disagreed or strongly disagreed with the in this case, the majority strongly disagreeing with the statement. So as you kind of go up the ladder in terms of how much does this affect me, DGPT women at the top, professional women next, and on down the list, there is more generally disagreement with the idea that transgender women should be able to participate. So it's worth noting there was no there was no way of determining who is in fact a female that competes primarily in DGPT. That was all self-reported and it was not checked. And it's also worth noting that there could be sample bias here in this entire survey. This does feel like a topic that motivates people who are against trans athletes competing more than those who are for it. And so that there could be sample bias there. Although I do think that it's fair to say that, disc golf probably does skew towards the center right to the right wing in terms of political persuasion, in terms of the makeup of the population of disc golf. A lot of rural, a lot of white male. That is a population that tends to be on the right wing. And it seems fairly clear that those beliefs correlate very strongly with not wanting transgender women to participate. So, I think there's caveats to look at in this data, but ultimately it does feel like the PDGA board decided that because its members didn't want transgender women participating, they made a rule change based on the majority opinion of the people in the organization.
A couple of things that I want to highlight as well. And Charlie, I know you know all this, but number one, surveys are an imperfect science because of, for a lot of reasons, but the one in particular that I think of is response bias. People who feel most strongly about subjects are more likely to fill out these surveys. And so those who are adamantly opposed or very much in favor were the most likely to fill out these surveys. Those who don't pay attention to professional disc golf as much, who don't, maybe don't play even at the highest level of amateur disc golf, probably didn't feel as engaged to the survey and probably did not respond. That is going to skew it to those who feel strongly about the matter, and does need to be taken into account. The other thing that I found interesting is, Charlie, your article on the FPO women side analyzed and said that there were 75 responses from FPO players who indicate that they primarily play FPO. Is that correct?
Who primarily play DGPT.
Or DGPT, excuse me. Thank you. That's what I meant.
Yeah, that's my understanding. It was a checkbox selection that says,
right.
I predominantly compete on the Disc Golf Pro Tour, something along those lines.
So the second slide of the survey says, and I think I appreciate that they include this, is that people lie on surveys. Some people lied on this survey. I think that's a really good disclaimer that is frank and well written. Typically it's behind kind of academic jargon about accuracy and how people choose to respond. But I think that's a very frank way to put it. 75 women who play, quote, primarily on the DGPT feels too high to me almost. When I look at like Worlds, for example, Worlds did not have 75 players in the FPO division. As a, just a quick spot check. When you go to standings and you go to Disc Golf Pro Tour standings and you drop down to the women who are in 75th, and I'm not indicating that they answered the survey or what have you. 75th is Jenny Carpin, who played the European Open. So that's a European player, but also tied for 75th was, there it is. Sammy Keddington, who played 4 events. I think the point I'm trying to make is that this survey, even the part on FPO players and their opinions, should not be the end-all be-all of, yep, that's what the PDGA membership feels. That's how the DGPT women feel. Therefore, needs to be the decision and cannot be, it should never be looked at again.
Yeah. I think you definitely raise good points. I think I would also note that the fact that the Pro Tour, despite having the option to, and this was explicitly written in the PDGA's new guidelines, that those who operate an elite series can do whichever they feel. Okay, so we're talking about the DGPT. The fact that the DGPT has chosen the more restrictive policy around all of their events tells me that it's at least the survey results are at least representative of the majority will of Pro Tour women.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can't say that with certainty. I doubt the Pro Tour will ever tell us that. But we've seen very few pros have been engaging this topic publicly. We have some pros, particularly in FPO, that have come out in support of transgender participants. Paige Pierce, Ella Hansen. We also have women who came out anonymously against transgender participation. Two players were cited in the Quillette article from a couple of months ago. And then we had Nico LaCastro talking about it on a Facebook comment, which I think suggests to me that Cat Merch maybe feels the same way and doesn't want there to... I mean, that's a stretch. Like, I'll admit, that's a stretch. I probably shouldn't put words in her mouth. But, I mean, it just... I think there's a groundswell of women on the Pro Tour that are not talking about this publicly, but that feel that it's unfair that Natalie Ryan is competing against them and winning tournaments. I mean, I just think that is the Occam's razor here based on what the Pro Tour has done. I mean, it's also worth noting the Pro Tour's fan base, based on looking at like live stream comments and comments on articles and things, seems very against, and it could be loud voices, but the audience seems against transgender participation in the FPO division. So I think there's like possibly a business argument there for the Pro Tour. But while I think the survey, it has things that we have to consider as caveats, I do think it probably is showing that the majority opinion is that transgender women shouldn't participate in FPO.
I think that's correct, and that's accurate. I think the hardest part then, when you take these two decisions, is it feels like the way, like, and again, I think you've highlighted this well, regardless of how you feel about the decision, it feels like the road by which we got here to this policy is one that was disappointing to me, I think is probably the best way I can put it. It takes the most restrictive policy option absolutely possible for the top level, based on a pretty flawed medical subcommittee report and a public anonymous survey that, though with the good response, does have its own limitations as well. And that's, I think, the big thing I take away from this is just the way that we got to the most restrictive policy in sports that still allow the most restrictive policy in sports, not including perhaps rugby as the exception.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the question is like, what are the alternatives? I mean, Joanna suggested that the amateur policy should have been the professional policy. Mm-hmm. That it should have just been a heavily reduced, testosterone limit, as well as a longer time frame for which to be under that limit. I think the tricky thing about this is that it's hard to find middle ground in some ways. And, if the science comes out that, in athletes, mm-hmm. in studies of transgender athletes, the athletes maintain a 12% advantage over cisgender women. Or whatever the number is, that's not an outlandish number based on the research that exists right now. I think we'll probably see more sports following what the Pro Tour has, or what the PDGA has done and what the Pro Tour has done. But let's say that it comes out that trans athletes, compared to women athletes, only have a 2% advantage or something. Or there is no advantage after a certain amount of hormone therapy, after a certain amount of time. I mean, the PDGA is going to look like clowns because they moved so fast and so aggressively on the topic.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, they've clearly chosen. It is worth noting that the most restrictive changes are limited to professional players, basically.
Correct.
And not just like those who compete as professionals in the PDGA and play at A tiers, but like actual professionals who are playing for money in a meaningful way as a like
touring professionals, as the phrase we usually use. Yeah.
And that the rest of the sport is still going to allow transgender women to compete, you know, with more restrictions, but still allowed to compete. And you know, there is a world in which the PDGA just outright blanket effectively banned in every division at every level, including C tiers. And they didn't do that. So I think when we talk about the like inclusion fairness spectrum, the PDGA didn't like go all in and just ban everybody, which that's going to be dissatisfying to some people. As you know, Natalie Ryan has already voiced her anger and frustration and said she's going to take this to court. This could be, we were talking off the air with Joanna, this could end up being one of the first very significant public cases of a top-level trans athlete filing a lawsuit against a sports governing body for its policies. And we are going to see how this plays out potentially. I mean, this could become international news. And so you have Natalie frustrated, but I think on the other side, you're probably going to have women who play at the amateur level in some cases, or men or whoever, that are frustrated that the PDGA didn't go further with those divisions. So this is not a like outright super restrictions on everybody. They carved out elite touring pros only, which, you know, in some ways gives credence to what Natalie Ryan has said, which I'll just read the quote. She told me yesterday, trans participation wasn't a problem until I was successful. I feel broken in the wake of these announcements, but one thing is clear to me. This decision was to force me off the tour, not to make it more fair. The research they used to justify this is a joke, and the fact that they use public opinion to make policy is downright lazy at best. I will prove their short-sighted hatred in court. So it's this is a tricky thing. I don't know that anybody feels like they know exactly what is the right thing to do here. You know, the IOC basically punted on setting new regulations, and they just told sports federations, do it yourself. But, you know, when you look at the principles that they laid out, with inclusion as the first one, you know, I have concerns that there's not enough of an established science base here for you to make a blanket decision. You know, and Natalie Ryan might be one of the furthest throwers in FPO. That's true. You know, she won the distance contest at Worlds in 2021, but she didn't win it this year. Ella Hansen won it, and people have accused Ella Hansen of being transgender. She is not, because she throws far and maybe doesn't present as feminine as some players on tour. It's a mess.
I think that's, you highlight there at the end, Charlie, one of my greatest fears with this decision, kind of my question on the enforcement goes back to it as well, is the weaponization of this policy against women in general, right? If you throw too far, if you don't look the part, you are going to be accused and perhaps required to verify eligibility because you don't meet people's expectations of what an FPO player should be. And that's something I think is sad, and I hope doesn't happen, but I have a fear that it will. The other thing that we were talking with Joanna a little bit off the air, she noted that a lot of governing federations report to the International Board of Arbitration for Sports based out of Switzerland. And she was speculating that this decision may actually not be done in a court, but rather in this arbitration court, right? that most federations agree to abide to. It wasn't until after a little bit further discussion, because I kind of asked if I could, how I would know if the PDGA does submit to said board, that that Joanna realized, thanks to your clarification, Charlie, that the PDGA is not the internationally recognized governing board for disc golf. That is still WFDF, the World Flying Disc Federation, that covers all flying disc sports, including ultimate and now disc golf, which have their respective governing bodies, PDGA and is it US Ultimate?
USA Ultimate, yeah.
USA Ultimate. That those two governing bodies, not internationally recognized, but the predominant ones in the United States, could not be further apart in their policies on trans athletes. And you noted, Charlie, WFDF has not come out with a policy yet.
Updated guidance, yeah.
Updated guidance. So
their policy, I think, is from 2018 and conforms to the previous IOC guidelines, but they have not yet updated the new guidelines, which sort of laid out late 2021.
That is going to be a hard conversation for WFDF, given that their requirements may not match federations inside the United States for their sports.
Yeah, and like what's that going to mean? How's that all going to play out?
It's an additional complicating factor to disc sports that I don't think other sports quite have the same level of having to deal with right now.
Well, we're certainly interested in getting your thoughts on this entire matter. Upshot@ultiworld.com is the best way to reach us. And, we're certainly going to be talking about this more. I think the board minutes are going to be coming out soon from the fall summit where this was discussed by the board of directors. I'm hoping we will find out about the votes, how they broke down. I don't know if they're going to publish who voted how, but at least the actual vote itself, I know it was a split vote, that it was not unanimous. So there's a lot more here. And I think I don't know how much more we're going to discuss it on the podcast, but this will be a topic that's not going to go away. So I think we should probably leave it here, Josh, unless you have any final thoughts.
The one thing I would add, regardless of your thoughts on the process, the decision, the policy, and the subject, be kind. Don't go out of your way to make hateful comments. And as you engage in the public forum, whether on this podcast, on our Discord, or in social medias, or in person, just be kind. And your feelings on the policy do not have to prevent you from being a kind and generous person to those who are most undoubtedly having a difficult time.
All right, so we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about Anthony Barela. We'll be right back. All right, we are back on the Upshot. Josh, Anthony Barela posted on Instagram that he is going to be leaving Innova after 9 years, sponsored by the manufacturer. No announcement yet where he's headed. But where do you rank this move in terms of fire emojis?
Yeah, it's kind of difficult for me because there are two trajectories that I really feel like Anthony Barela could follow. Right, the first trajectory is really like it's hard. We have seen Anthony Barela on tour for quite a while now. Is that 3-4 years at least? Yeah,
I mean, I feel like I don't remember a time without him being on tour in my memory.
Right. Yes, he's still young, but being on tour for so long, I kind of feel like I'm of the opinion that I know what we're going to get from Anthony Barela, and moving manufacturers might give him a little bit more face time, a little bit more as kind of an attention person who has the opportunity to probably increase his profile and thus increase his earnings. But competitively speaking, I don't see this as like he's going to move and then all of a sudden have a breakout year and we're going to be talking about Anthony Barela next season like we're talking about Gannon and Burr right now. That's kind of where I fall in this fire emoji. So like, I don't know, out of 5, maybe 2.5?
Yeah.
2?
Mid tier. I mean, it's worth noting. He came into the year rated 1025. He did touch the 1030s during 2021. But I think he has showed us that he has leveled up his game in 2022. He's at 1037 now. That's career high for him. And he had some really nice showings this year. 4th at OTB Open, 4th at Ledgestone. He was 7th at Worlds, remember? And,
that's true.
Also had some 13th at USDGC, had some spots where he didn't play as well, a little bit inconsistent, but there were multiple tournaments where he was on the lead card or in the lead. And I think what we saw from him, and I've talked about it a couple weeks ago, he has had some struggles with playing under pressure. But from a talent perspective, the guy is incredible, out of this world. I mean, he has one of the shots of the year. That laser line drive through the low ceiling tunnel that he like gets all the way up and around the corner, like 550, 600 feet plus. I mean, just totally crazy. And I mean, it's obvious enough when you watch him throw that he's one of the most powerful throwers on tour. I think they clocked him at the highest release speed at the $1 Million Ace contest. So the potential is massive. And I think that Anthony Barela was falling into the trap that many at Innova do, which is that they're just a cog in the machine, one of many. Oh, Anthony Barela, yeah, he's an Innova guy. This is just good business, like I don't know where he's going.
Yes.
We'll find out. There's been a lot of speculation already, Discmania, like from a skills perspective, I could see it, but I don't know that Discmania is going to be throwing out big cash at more pros right now. Who knows? Discraft, right? He's an Arizona guy. Discraft's got a lot of sway down there. It could be one of these companies in Texas. Like, there's a lot of potential fits. But I think that it's a good risk reward signing for a manufacturer, because at worst you get a guy who throws really far. And like, that's a pretty good thing to have. And at best, you get a guy who could level up into the 1040s and threaten to win tournaments. I mean, he's not that far away from winning a couple tournaments this year.
I think that's accurate. I really think kind of my next level comparison, maybe this isn't even fair to Anthony Barela, but I mean, yeah, it looks like he played better. It reminds me, he really is a young and probably more talented Double G. And we've seen, putting is definitely Anthony Barela's deficiency, in addition to nerves. It's not as bad as Double G's. He also, I think, is a little more accurate than Double G. But there is a marketability about players like that who throw really, really far and are just incredibly fun to watch. That, like you said, is just, as a business decision, no brainer. And Anthony's going to get paid, and whichever manufacturer takes him is going to sell discs. I don't really have any question about that. I always found it weird that, Anthony Barela's discs over Innova was a fairway driver. And it's just because the Destroyer was already taken by Calvin and Ricky and previously Paul. Right? Everybody's got their name on the Destroyer already. And so, Anthony did not get that opportunity, but I really think some distance drivers in wherever he goes, they're going to sell pretty well. And so business wise, I think it's great. Fire emojis, like I said, 2 to 2.5. Maybe.
He finished 2 spots ahead of Double G in the Disc Golf Pro Tour standings this year. Just quick stats check in on Barela: 11th in Circle 1 in regulation, 8th in Circle 2 in regulation on tour, 10th in birdie percentage. The problems: 55th in Circle 1X putting, and 109th in OB rate.
Yep.
There it is.
There it is.
It's kind of a feast or famine, high risk, high reward driver. I think if he can start to keep it between the lines a little bit more, we've seen what it's done for Simon's career. To be fair, Simon's a much better putter than Anthony.
Yes.
But, the tools are there. The tools are there. So I'm interested to see where he ends up. All right. That's going to do it for today's show. Barring other massive breaking news, on Thursday, we will be doing our storylines bracket. We're going to pick the story of the year in our bracket competition, and it's perfect timing with the World Cup. So looking forward to that. And don't miss it. Coming soon. Gaffes and weird stuff bracket. Next week on the Upshot.